and welcome to the workshop. In this video we're going to be making a little table for a bar out of all these pieces of oak I have in front of me. I got this stuff roughly dimensioned in a sawmill recently, and from here on out we're going to be working it entirely with hand tools to turn her into a table. I'm going to be explaining what I'm doing as I go along, so hopefully you guys enjoy. So I'm going to start with the tabletop here. So I've got 3 pieces. So now I need to join to the edges, make sure they all sit together nice. Now if we look at this piece here, we can see the grain is shooting up this direction. So that means we place it in our vise like this. This here is a Stanley number 32 jointer plane. So I'm going to run that over the edge a few times. Now we're taking a few very fine cuts, so I'm just going to engage the iron a small bit more. There we go. Now, what I'm looking to do is take a consistent shaving the whole length of the board. There's still a bit of a shallow spot here, I feel. There we go. I think that's a perfectly square edge. So I'm going to remove her from the vise now. Place in the adjacent plank. Lads, that is exactly what we're looking for. Still not quite squared up, so we're going to go again. So now what we should have is 2 bits of wood that join together without any visible gap in between the 2 of them. So another step, I'm going to make sure that they all have their grain flowing in the same direction. So I can roughly make out that the grain is shooting up this way. So have it here in our end vise, Stanley number 3. So running across it like that. Okay, so I see a little bit of tear out here, but mostly the grain is going this direction. Small amount of tear out here. That's fine. I think I can probably sand that out towards the very end. So I needed some dowels to join the 3 planks of the tabletop together. So I started with this little oak offcut here and used the chisel and the mallet to crack off a small section just like this. This is some sort of engineer's tool. I'm not sure what exactly, but it's a bit of steel with a load of holes in it. I use it to make dowels. Here I am sizing up this auger bit to see what size I need to make these dowels to. So I start by placing the smaller end on top of the largest hole here and just driving it the whole way through with the mallet. Once I have it through the largest hole, I like to pair it on the smaller side just to make it easier to drive through the next set of holes. Then I work my way down through smaller and smaller holes until I get to the size of the auger I'm using. Once I have it down to size, I like to pair it on both sides just to make it easier when it comes to fitting it into the plank later on. Now I want all my dowels to line up. And in order for that to happen, I just need to mark out where on the planks the dowels need to go. So here I am now using my tape measure to do that. I clamped everything in place beforehand just to make sure everything was in order. The next time we'll be using those will be for the glue up. So next I went to mark out my lines. Ideally I'd be using a marking knife, but I couldn't find that until later in the video. So here I am using a pencil and then an awl just to mark in where we want our auger to start drilling. We used our brace and bit here to bore the holes. I have this bit of masking tape here to mark the depth that we need to cut to. The brace and bit is slow going, especially when you compare it to some of the modern power drills you have, but there's nothing quite as satisfying as a nice sharp auger bit drilling into a bit of timber. Next came time to fit the dowels. It's always a bit nerve-wracking. You're a bit nervous that you've made the dowels too big and you're going to split your timber, or you've made them too short and they're going to go the whole way in. But this time seemed to be a success. You can really see where it bottoms out there and won't go any further. With all the dowels in place on one side of the timber, it was time to drill the opposing holes. This is why our line earlier was important. These really do need to line up. If they don't, you're in serious trouble. So the first set lined up all right, which was great. Now it was time to cut the next joint. I did manage to find my marking knife this time, which gives us a bit more of an exact line. I'm also using my marking gauge here, again, more precise than a pencil. And finally our awl to get ourselves set up for the brace and bit once more. So with everything lining up all right, it was time for the glue up. I make a big fuss about being a traditionalist and only using hand tools and whatnot, but I haven't got around to the whole traditional glues like hide glue or anything like that. So here I am using Gorilla Glue. Bit of a cop-out, I know, but it's always kind of reassuring with these modern glues. They're just so strong that, you know, if you do everything right, they're not going to let you down. First, I tapped everything together with the mallet, then clamped it together, made sure all the joints were good and tight, then left it for 48 hours to dry out. So with the glue set, I could take off the clamps, and then it was time to plane it all down to a flat, even surface. So I started with my Stanley number 3. I find my hands are a bit big for the number 3, but I couldn't find my number 4 anywhere, so I said I'd use that. So the idea behind using the plane is to remove all the high spots and bring the table down to a nice flat level surface. So I'm using a pencil here just to scribble all over the table so that when I go to use the plane, I shave off all the high spots, but I can still see where the low spots are, so I can know to keep working that spot down until we get it all nice and plain. Now I'm going across the grain, which can sometimes be easier when you need to level it all down, but before I finish this, I then went with the grain. That kind of gives us a nicer kind of glossy finish. I will be going back over this with sandpaper before we put on the finish, but for the time being, that's pretty much us finished up on the tabletop, and now we can start working on the legs. So here we have a nice long length of oak here. This piece is long enough to drive 2 legs from, so that's exactly what we're going to do. First of all, I'm going to measure out my distance, and then use my 6-inch square just to mark out my line with the marking knife. Next, we pull up our crosscut saw. This is a vintage disc in here. When you're cutting, make sure you can always see at least 2 lines at any given time. So I'm starting here on the top corner and just letting the saw do most of the work, all the while checking that we're tracking our line okay. Perfect. So for the next 2 legs, I'm also getting them out of one piece of oak here. Now this piece, we're going to have to rip cut. The first 2 legs we got from cross cutting, a big long piece, basically cutting across the grain with our cross cut saw. This time, however, we're going to have to use our rip cut saw, which has its teeth filed in a different way that makes it better for cutting down along the length of the grain. So we're using our marking gauge again here, just to scribe out our line before we can pick up our saw and rip the whole long length of it down. before we had table saws, this is pretty much how all lengths of timber were ripped down. It's slow going, but it's satisfying, especially when you've got a nice good saw. Again, you're just letting the tool do the work. This is an outdistant and it's handy because it's got an extra thumb hole, so it's very ergonomic. So with the legs roughly cut, I decided to start working on the aprons. This is the part that joins the top of the legs and the actual tabletop together. For this, I'm doing a mortise and tenon joint. So here I am now, just marking out the tenon with my marking knife. So once I had the length of the tenon marked out, it was time to figure out the width of it. So for that, I'm using my marking gauge just to mark in a small bit. Then I use the chisel that I'm going to use to cut my mortise with to mark out the depth I want this tenon to be. With the joint marked out, I could finally start cutting away material, so I'm just using my back saw for that. I start by going a small bit away from the line I want to cut and just pulling back with the saw. This kind of gives me a groove in which I can take my proper cuts, like so. So with our cross cut done, I'm going to stick it into the tail vise here and use the same rip saw to cut on down to that line. Exact same technique, just pulling back on the wood and making sure our hand, shoulder and elbow are all aligned and just letting the saw do the work. So the reason we cut a bit away from our line is because it's very difficult to cut straight up to the line with the saw. It's easier to give a small bit of space and then come back after with the chisel and cut exactly down to our line. Now we weren't done yet. I needed to cut a haunch, which is kind of like a step onto this tenon, and it basically stops the timber on the mortise side of the joint from blowing out on the end where the grain is short. So it's a traditional technique, time tested. So that's what we're going for here. This table is very much inspired by traditional Irish vernacular tables. These are kind of tables that would have been found in the households of people who didn't have a lot of money, kind of made the tables themselves in their free time with whatever materials they could get their hands on. There's a book called Irish Country Furniture, 1700 to 2000, by a woman called Claudia Kinmouth. So I got a lot of the inspiration for the basic design from that book, as well as images and visiting the Museum of Country Life up in County Mayo. Now this isn't a replica of any table I saw anywhere. I'm working to measurements that were given to me by the pub owner. Now aside from the size and the height of it, he pretty much gave me all the creative control I wanted. The table is going into a very old country pub, so I felt that drawing from traditional designs would be a good way to kind of match that aesthetic. So with the tenon cut, now it was time to cut the corresponding mortise in our leg here. Now there was marks on this leg from the rip sawing we had just done earlier, as well as from the mill where we got the timber from. So a quick few passes with the smoothing plane and the jack plane here gives us a nice flat plane surface to work off. Similarly to how we marked out our tenon, we're using our marking gauge and the width of our chisel to mark out the corresponding mortise. So I'm using my 1-inch chisel here just to kind of score the line so we don't get any tear out. Then I use the mortise chisel to remove a couple of first few millimeters into the mortise. And we can crack out the brace and bit, do most of the heavy lifting before coming back again afterwards with the 1-inch chisel to clear it out. So next I did a dry fit, basically putting the mortise into the tenon without using any glue or a peg or anything to hold it in place. So I was pretty happy with how that one turned out. So now what I'm doing here is just scribing a line at the end of the tenon with the chisel, just so I can cut it at 45 degrees. That way I don't have any trouble with the two tenons on both of the aprons bumping into each other at the end when they're inside the legs. With all the aprons done, it was time to cut the stretchers. So this is another horizontal support element of the table. The stretchers are usually only a few inches above the ground and they hold all the 4 legs together. I was going for a through wedged tenon design. Basically that means my tenon here is going to stick the whole way through the joint so it's visible from the other end, and then basically it'll have a wedge. So as well as the glue, the wedge will help hold the joint into place. So after cutting the mortise through the side stretcher, I needed to cut a mortise into the legs to receive the side stretcher itself. For this I was just cutting a regular mortise, which isn't going to go the whole way through our piece of wood here, but instead as deep or slightly deeper than the length of the tenon itself. Now all the other joints in this table are going to be secured either by a peg or a wedge, except for these ones here. On this one we're relying purely on friction alone. I will be using a bit of wood glue, but it's still important that we have a nice tight fit to begin with. I've been doing a lot of letter carving recently and decided I want to incorporate it into this project. The pub where this table is going to end up is known locally as Flans. This is a fun way of making the table a bit more personal to the place it's going to be situated in, but also as a means to prevent it going anywhere else. Unless now there's another pub out there, also called Flans, who wants the table, or somebody called Flan who fancies themselves this table as soon as they set their eyes on it. There's a Georgian tombstone located not too far from this workshop here, dating from 1799. I really liked the lettering on it, so I traced it one day with a bit of paper and a graphite pencil. I'm aiming my chisel roughly 45 to 60 degrees from the flat plane of the wood, hitting it in from both angles to remove most of the material, and then coming back later again with the chisel and kind of paring down the finished surface. This used to be a 1/2-inch chisel, but I took it down on the grinder and turned it into a custom-made chisel specifically for cutting these ends of the letters here, which are known as serifs. On the opposing apron on the other side of the table, I carved my initials as well as the year. In the right conditions, oak can last hundreds, maybe thousands of years, so it's always nice to think that when I'm long gone, people might still be sat at the table, wondering who ER was back in 2024. Now, the letters are perfectly legible without staining them, but I'm going to stain it anyway. I think adding a dark stain to the letters makes them contrast nicely and makes them a small bit more legible. So what I'm using to stain is a mixture of vinegar and steel wool. Basically shoved this bottle of vinegar full of steel wool and left it sit for 24 hours. Now, I'm not much of a scientist, but some sort of chemical reaction happens between this mixture and the oak. I think there's tannins in the oak and they mix with it and basically turn jet black. I'm using a pencil here just to make sure there's no little air bubbles. We want every single surface within these letters to be covered. After it's had some time to dry, I flip it around so that I'm going with the grain here now when I go to use my hand plane. I give the sole a quick wax just to reduce any friction and remove a couple of thousandths of an inch from the top surface layer. This is a very satisfying process. Basically removes any stain that ended up outside of the letters. My one and only regret about the table is these letters. I think I made them a bit too big, but sure, look, not the end of the world. I'll know for next time, and it's done now. I wasn't going to go redoing all the joinery, and I didn't have any spare oak planks that I could remake the apron with. With our letter carving done, that pretty much rounds up all the individual piece making, and now we can begin the fun process of assembling the table. So I'm starting here with the stretchers, cutting a slit at the end of our through tenon. For added security, I apply a small layer of glue all around the tenon. While I was working on this table, I found a piece of bog oak near the workshop, which is unusual because there's no bogs or anything around this area, so I really don't know how it ended up here. But I took it into the workshop anyway, and I cut a small piece off, and that's what we're using as our wedge here. A bog oak is basically ancient trees. This one is likely close to 10,000 years old that was cut or fell down and ended up in a bog environment that was low oxygen and acidic, so basically preserved for thousands of years before eventually ending up in my hands for use in this table. So I needed to cut a chamfer on all the sharp edges. Chamfer is basically exactly that, cutting into a sharp edge, and this reduces the likelihood of it cracking or splitting. The plane I'm using is probably my most rare and definitely one of my most useless hand planes. It is a Stanley number 72, and it is a chamfer plane, so it serves one function, and that function is cutting chamfers. And I know you might be thinking to yourself, oh, could you not use a spoke shaver chisel or just a regular jack plane to do that? And yes, you absolutely could. And that's exactly why this plane wasn't very popular at all, and hence why it's so rare and hard to come by now. So when I saw this pop up for sale, I didn't have to buy it, but I just felt I might not get the opportunity again, as the Irish hand plane market is fairly barren. I suppose the one upside is it allows you to get all your chamfers identical to each other, all at the exact same depth. It's not exactly very important, but Suppose it is one nice feature, and seeing as I have the plane, I may as well use it. So as well, before assembling them, I just liked to sand all my pieces up to 120 grit. I did this by placing a block of timber behind the sandpaper and just rubbing it up and down along the timber until we got it all nice and smooth. I didn't go up to any higher grits because I felt I didn't need to. Once you go above 120, the sawdust becomes so fine it starts clogging up the pores in the wood, and that makes it more difficult for the wood to take on an oil finish further down the line. So for now, everything is being sanded up to 120 grit. Now there were some tricky areas of tear out, basically where a hand plane was causing the fibres to tear up and become all loose. So in order to fix this problem, I simply got a really sharp knife here and pulled it, kind of used it like a scraper, go in the direction of the grain, and then I just sanded it like the rest of it. Now I could have just used glue to hold the legs and the aprons together, but I wanted to do something a little bit more strong. I used a clamp to squeeze them together good and tight. Then I used the bracelet bit to bore down through the leg and through the tenon. I tied a bit of masking tape onto my bit here. That way I know once the tape starts rubbing against the wood that I need to stop engaging, because I'm going to go the whole way through the leg and that might look unsightly. With our holes bored, we could now remove the clamp and remove the tenon from the mortise. To hold the joint in place, I'm using glue, but I'm also using wooden dowels I made out of bog oak. Now I'm sure glue and friction alone would have been enough to hold it into place, but I kind of like the look of the bog oak pegs once they're in situ, and also they have a functional purpose of course making the joint a little bit stronger. Although I was using the rawhide side of my mallet to join all the timbers together without leaving a dent in the wood, this joint was being a bit stubborn, so I decided to put a piece in between that I could hit really hard. Although the rawhide doesn't usually leave a mark, when you really go hell for leather with it, you tend to leave a little mark here and there, so this is just stopping that from happening. Another fun thing about using the pegs is you don't have to use any clamps to hold the whole thing together once it's glued up. So with the tabletop and the legs finished, I needed to come up with something to attach the two of them together. So here I have an ash offcut. The idea was fairly simple, just bore 2 holes on either end of it, going down the whole way through the piece. Then bore another hole on the other side face, going the whole way through. Countersink them so the brass screws we use later sit flush with the face, and we are good to go. Now the reason I used brass screws is because steel screws slowly stain the oak over time. The same process that we used to stain our lettering earlier could be used against us. So using brass or copper will prevent that from happening. So with the tabletop firmly secured onto the legs, we were on the home stretch and the only thing left to do now was finish it. The finish I'm going for with this table is an oil and wax finish. I'm using 3 coats of Danish oil, the first coat of which I'm going to roughly dilute by 1/5 with some white spirits. This will kind of thin out the oil, allowing for it to penetrate deeper into the wood. Here we are now giving the well-seasoned oak its first taste of oil. This leg here just so happened to be quarter sawn, so the Irish oak really gets a chance to show off its gorgeous medullary rays here. It's these rays that transfer nutrients in and out of the trunk. They show up much more commonly when oak is split, riven or cleaved. Sometimes if a sawmill operator knows what he's doing, you'll get to see the beautiful pattern on sawn pieces of timber also. I've always found watching the first layer of oil get applied very therapeutic. I love watching the colour of the wood pop as the grain gets raised, and the stain within the lettering often turns a darker shade of black. So I left the oil set for half an hour and then rubbed away some of the excess with some tissue paper. I then waited for 24 hours before adding the next layer. I left it for a few days to make sure the oil had good chance to dry out. Finally, I added a layer of beeswax. Not only will this enhance the wood's natural luster, it'll also give an added layer of protection. With the waxing done, then came the sweetest day of all, Deliverance Day. I hopped in my car and drove up to Tulla in County Clare, a town where I had spent many a night during my summer residency in the nearby Bunratty Castle and Folk Park. I had on a number of occasions, whilst passing through, admired the MacArthur shopfront on the main street. It was only a matter of time before I stuck my snout in the door. For decades the pub was owned and ran by a man called Flan MacArthur, and to this day, the pub is still known locally as Flans. It's one of those pubs oozing with cosy old world charm that seem to be becoming ever rarer. As well as being built on a hill, the pub was built into the hill. I suppose there was no heavy machinery or rock breakers in those days, so instead of cutting into the rock, they simply built on top of it. This means the floor below you once you step in is anything from level, sloping upwards in front of you at what must be an angle of 10 degrees. I'm sure once upon a time it was very handy for brushing out the old straw and whatever else was used for lining the floor. Nowadays it makes quite the quirky feature, and to be honest with you, it was one of the main reasons I agreed to take up this project in the first place. With the old synthetic timber table removed, my one could take its place, where it'll hopefully sit for many years to come. I love that all but the patch of tile beneath the table has been worn away over time. But this was no time for observation. What kind of craftsperson would I be if I went to the effort of making and installing a table without making sure to test it to see that it was fit for purpose? Diarmuid, the man who runs the pub and commissioned the table, works for the Guinness Quality Assurance team. So a pint of stout from Flans is yet to be a disappointment on my end anyway. The whole time I was making the table, I was really looking forward to seeing how the cream would settle on top of a pint once placed on the table that was on the slope. I had asked Diarmuid at the very beginning if he wanted me to make two of the legs slightly longer than the others so that the tabletop would actually sit level. He told me that he remembers somebody asking Flan, the previous owner, the very same thing. Someone had offered to cut two of the legs shorter to level out the table. Flan responded no, thinking that it was better to leave the table as it were. Out of fear, someone would rotate the table around and then you'd have twice the slope. Anyway, this was a very enjoyable project. Thank you, Diarmuid, for the commission, and thank you guys if you have chosen to watch this far. If you're ever passing through Tulla, County Clare, be sure to pop in and check out the table. Sláinte.
If you're ever looking at a glass